I fed them. I clothed them. I drove them to hockey practice in -20 weather when my old knees screamed at me the whole way there. I was 63 years old and raising 3 kids who weren't mine to raise, except they were because no one else was going to do it. My son left them with me on a Tuesday. He called it temporary. He said he just needed to get things sorted. He said he had some problems with his girlfriend. The woman he'd moved in with 6 months earlier, the one none of us had met until Christmas dinner, the one who looked at my grandchildren like they were furniture left in the wrong room. He said he needed 2 weeks, maybe 3. He left a bag of clothes for the youngest and a box of cereal on my kitchen counter. That was 11 years ago. The youngest was 4. She didn't understand what was happening. She kept asking me where her daddy was, and I kept telling her he'd be back soon, and I kept believing it myself, because what kind of father doesn't come back? My oldest grandson was 9, and he understood more than I wanted him to. He stopped asking after the first month. He just started carrying his own lunch to school and checking on his little sister at recess. At 9 years old. My middle one, the girl, she was 7, and she cried herself to sleep for the first 4 months until one night she just stopped. And I sat outside her door in the dark hallway, wondering if that was better or worse. I live in Sudbury, Northern Ontario. It gets cold here in a way that city people don't fully understand. The kind of cold that gets into the pipes and into your joints and into your mood. My wife, their grandmother, had passed 3 years before all this started. Cancer, fast and merciless. And I was still figuring out how to live alone in the house we'd shared for 31 years when suddenly the house wasn't alone at all. I had retired early from the mine. I had a pension, a small one, and some savings. I had a vegetable garden in the back. I had a woodworking shop in the garage and a truck with 200,000 kilometers on it and a neighbor named Hector who came over most Sundays to watch the Leafs lose. That was my life. And then it wasn't. I won't pretend the first year wasn't hard. The grocery bill alone nearly knocked me sideways. 3 kids eat differently than one old man. There was always someone who needed something. New boots, a school permission slip signed, a trip to the walk-in clinic at 8 in the morning. I learned what head lice was. I learned what a reading log was. I sat at the kitchen table every night helping with homework. I barely remembered from my own childhood, squinting at fractions and spelling lists and some kind of new math that looked nothing like any math I'd ever done. I tried reaching my son. For the first 2 years, I tried constantly. I called. I left messages. I drove to the last address I had for him in Timmins, and the apartment was already rented to someone else. His sister, my daughter, she tried too. She's a practical woman, always has been, works in healthcare administration in Halifax. She said he'd always been the one who ran from things. She said it like she'd known this was coming. Maybe she had. There was no formal custody arrangement, no paperwork, nothing legal. He just left and didn't come back, and I just stayed and didn't stop. I registered the children at their school as living with me. I took them to the family doctor, Dr. Harrington, who'd been our doctor since my kids were small, and he updated the files without making a big thing out of it. The school principal, a woman named Mrs. Dupuy, she knew our situation within the first semester. She was good about it. She'd give me a nod in the hallway at pickup, the kind of nod that said she understood. The kids grew up. That's the only way I can say it. They just grew up right there in front of me in the same house where I'd raised their father, in the same rooms with the same drafty windows and the same creak on the stair. My oldest grandson learned to shovel the driveway without being asked. My granddaughter became obsessed with drawing and covered the fridge in sketches. The youngest, my littlest, she started calling me Pop somewhere around age 6, and the other 2 picked it up, and that was that. I'm not telling you this so you'll think I'm a hero. I'm seeing you this so you'll understand what was at stake when everything fell apart. My son showed up in April, 11 years after he left. He didn't come alone. He came with a woman I'd never seen and a man in a suit who introduced himself as a lawyer. They pulled up in a rental car. I noticed the sticker on the bumper, and they knocked on my front door like they were there to read the meter. I hadn't spoken to my son in almost 8. The last time we'd talked, it was a phone call, short and circular. Him saying he was getting himself together, me saying the children needed to know he was okay, both of us talking around the thing we weren't saying. He'd sounded far away in a way that had nothing to do with the phone connection. When I opened the door and saw him, my first thought, and I'm not proud of this, was that he looked terrible, thin in the wrong way, but clean. Whatever had been chasing him for 11 years, he'd either outrun it or made a kind of peace with it. He was wearing a jacket that was too nice for Sudbury in April. The woman beside him had her arms crossed. He didn't say hello. The lawyer spoke first. He said they were there to discuss the living situation of the children. He used words like custodial arrangement and parental rights and current circumstances. He had a folder. He was already opening it. I said, "You should leave." My son finally looked at me. He said, "Dad, just hear us out." I said, "There is nothing to hear. You left these children on my doorstep 11 years ago. You left a box of cereal and a bag of clothes, and you drove away and you did not come back. Whatever you have in that folder has nothing to do with me." The lawyer said I was mistaken about that. He said my son had retained him to pursue a formal custody arrangement, and that as part of that process, they'd be requesting that the children be returned to their father's care, with a transition plan, of course, very reasonable, very structured. I told him to get off my property. He didn't get off my property. He got louder instead. He used the word kidnapping. He said I had been unlawfully keeping the children from their father. He said there was no legal basis for my guardianship. He said if I didn't cooperate, they would involve the police. I shut the door. I stood in my hallway with my hand still on the doorknob, and I could hear them talking on the porch. And then I heard the rental car start, and then I heard it pull away. And I stood there for a long time in the quiet. My oldest grandson was 20 years old by then. He'd been in his first year at Laurentian before dropping out to work at the hardware store. That's a whole other story, and his choice to make, not mine. He came downstairs while I was still standing in the hallway. He said, "Pop, who was that?" I said, "Your father." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "What did he want?" I told him, all of it. He listened without interrupting, which was something he'd learned sometime in the last few years, that stillness. When I finished, he said, "Okay," and went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. And I thought, that right there, that's who this boy is. That's 11 years of my house in one word. The next morning, 2 police officers came to the door. They were professional about it. I want to be fair. They were doing their job and they were decent about it. But there's no good way to stand in your own kitchen while someone in a uniform tells you that a complaint has been filed, that a father has reported his children as being unlawfully retained, that they'll need to speak to the children. They did speak to the children. My oldest grandson told them exactly what he remembered, clearly and without drama. My granddaughter, 18 by then, studying at college in North Bay, home for Easter, sat at the kitchen table and laid out the timeline with a precision that made me feel something I can only describe as fierce, helpless pride. The youngest, 15, said very little to the officers, but looked at them with an expression I recognized. It was the expression she used when she was deciding whether someone was worth her time. They also spoke to Mrs. Dupuy. She'd since become vice principal. They spoke to Dr. Harrington. They spoke to Hector, my neighbor, who apparently told them a great deal, in more words than I've ever heard him use, about what kind of man I was and what kind of household this had been for 11 years. And still, somehow it wasn't enough. My son's lawyer was good at what he did. I'll give him that. He found an argument that had teeth. No formal custody order, no legal guardianship documents, just an old man and 3 kids living in a house with no paperwork to explain why. In the eyes of a certain reading of the law, that was a problem. I was told I needed a lawyer. I didn't have money for a lawyer. My pension was enough for the house, the groceries, the truck repairs. It wasn't enough for a family law attorney in Sudbury. My daughter flew in from Halifax on a Thursday night and sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning going through my finances, and the number she came to wasn't good. That was the lowest point. Not the police, not my son on the porch with his folder. The lowest point was sitting at that table under the kitchen light with my daughter looking at numbers, knowing that 11 years of doing the right thing had left me without the means to fight for it. There was a man I knew named Clifford. We'd worked the same crew at the mine for 6 years before we both retired. Clifford was not the kind of man you called for emotional support. He was the kind of man you called when something needed to be done. He showed up at my house 2 days after I told him what was happening, and he said he'd been doing some asking around, and he had a name. The name was a legal aid lawyer in Sudbury, a woman named Ms. Vachon. She took family cases involving grandparent guardianship. She was, Clifford said, very good and very angry, which he meant as a compliment. He was right on both counts, Ms. Vachon called my son's lawyer creative, in a tone that meant the opposite of a compliment. She said we had a strong case on the merits. 11 years of stable care, school records, medical records, community ties, the children's own stated preferences, which matter enormously in Canadian family law once they're old enough to express them. She said the word kidnapping had no legal basis here and that she'd be addressing that directly. She also said it would still take time. Family court in Ontario does not move fast. She said I needed to be prepared for the process. I was 64 years old and I was prepared for whatever I had to be. There's something that happened during this time that I need to tell you about. My son's lawyer sent a letter to the house. It was addressed to me, but it wasn't really for me. It was an offer. If I agreed to a voluntary transfer of care, that's what they called it, voluntary, as if I had any say, they would not pursue the kidnapping allegation further. There would be no charges. I would be free to have regular contact with the children going forward, which the letter described as reasonable visitation. Reasonable visitation. With children I had raised from 4, 7, and 9 years old. I almost threw the letter in the wood stove. I had it in my hand, walking toward the garage, when Clifford stopped me. He said, "Give that to your lawyer." I said, "I don't need a lawyer to tell me what I think of this letter." He said, "No, but you might need it to show a judge." I gave it to Ms. Vachon. She read it, and then she looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "They just made a mistake." Meanwhile, something was happening that no one on my son's side had accounted for. My oldest grandson asked if he could speak to Ms. Vachon directly. He was 20 years old. In Ontario, a 20-year-old is not a child in the eyes of the court. He could say whatever he wanted, to whoever he wanted, on his own behalf and on behalf of his experience. He sat in Ms. Vachon's office, and he talked for 45 minutes, and when I asked him afterward what he said, he told me he told the truth. He said he told them what it was like to be 9 years old and watch a car pull out of a driveway. He said he told them what it was like to grow up in a house where someone showed up every day, even when that someone had bad knees and couldn't remember new math and burned the macaroni at least once a month. I had to look out the window for a moment when he told me that. My granddaughter, 18, submitted a written statement. She'd prepared it herself. I didn't know she was doing it until she handed me a copy, 8 pages, clear and measured and devastating. She'd documented dates. She remembered things I'd forgotten. The year I sold the snowmobile to cover their school fees. The winter I worked part-time at the Canadian Tire in town to cover the orthodontist for the youngest. I hadn't known she remembered those things. The youngest, 15, met with a child advocate appointed by the court. I wasn't in the room. I don't know exactly what she said, but Ms. Vachan told me afterward that the advocate's report was thorough and unambiguous. The hearing was in June. My son's lawyer had built his case on the paperwork gaps, the absence of formal custody documents, the technical legal vacuum that 11 years of informal care had existed in. It was a real argument. I won't pretend it wasn't. But Ms. Vachan had the letter. She presented it to the judge, a woman named Justice Arsenault, quiet and methodical, and she said this letter demonstrated that my son was not motivated by the welfare of the children. She said a father genuinely concerned with his children's well-being would have shown up at any point in 11 years. She said this letter was an attempt to use the children as leverage to avoid accountability, and that the offer of reasonable visitation to a grandfather who had functioned as the sole parent for over a decade was, in her words, illuminating. The judge agreed. She said a few things I'll carry with me. She said the law recognizes stability as one of the most a child's best interest in determining, she said the children's own voices through my grandson's testimony, my granddaughter's statement, and the advocate's report had been consistent and credible. She said the word kidnapping had no place in these proceedings and that its use had been inappropriate. She denied my son's application. She granted me formal legal guardianship of my youngest granddaughter, who was 15 and had 4 more years before adulthood. She noted the other 2 were legal adults and their relationship with me was their own to define. My son left the courthouse without speaking to me. His lawyer looked, for just a moment, like a man who'd brought a snow shovel to a flood. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. Standing on the steps of the courthouse in Sudbury in June, with Miss Vachan shaking my hand and Clifford clapping me on the shoulder hard enough to rattle my fillings, I mostly felt tired and grateful, and something else that took me a few days to name. What I felt was witnessed. Like 11 years of invisible work had finally been seen by someone with the authority to say, yes, this happened. This was real. Clifford drove me home. We stopped at the Tim Hortons on the way, and I bought him a coffee and a butter tart, which is not much of a reward for a man who probably saved your life by stopping you from burning legal evidence in your wood stove. But it's what I had. My granddaughter had made dinner. All 3 of them were at the house when I walked in. My oldest had closed at the hardware store early. My granddaughter had driven down from North Bay. My youngest had made a terrible attempt at my wife's chicken and rice recipe that I told her was wonderful, and it mostly was. They decorated the kitchen table with a piece of construction paper that said Pop wins in marker, which I told them was embarrassing, which it was. Which I didn't mean at all. I still have it. It's in the drawer in the kitchen, folded in quarters. I take it out sometimes. There's one more thing. After everything settled, Ms. Vachan mentioned something I hadn't known. She said that during the process, someone had reached out to the court's Family Services Unit to provide additional character information about me, unsolicited, without me asking. It was Mrs. Dupuy, the vice principal. She'd written a letter about my oldest grandson's first week of school 11 years ago. How he'd shown up with his lunch packed by himself and sat very straight and very quiet and didn't ask for anything. How she'd called the home number and an old man had answered and explained the situation, and how she had watched over 9 years what happened in that family. she said. And Ms. Vachan read me the line, I have worked in schools for 27 years. I have seen many children pass through difficult circumstances. I have rarely seen a child watched over the way these children were watched over. I didn't cry when the judge ruled. I didn't cry when my grandchildren made that sign. I cried when Ms. Vachan read me that line, sitting in her office with the afternoon coming through the window, a Tuesday in July, 27 years of someone else's work choosing, for no reason except that it was true, to stand up and say so. My youngest starts grade 11 in September. She wants to be a veterinarian. She's good with animals in the unsentimental way that usually means you'll be good at the hard parts too. My oldest is saving to go back to school. My granddaughter is finishing her diploma and already talking about what comes next. My knees are worse. Hector still comes on Sundays. I burned the macaroni again last week. Clifford says I should write all this down. I told him nobody wants to read about an old man in Sudbury who just kept showing up. He said I was wrong. Maybe he's right. He usually is. I don't know what my son is doing now. I don't wish him badly. I wish him the kind of reckoning that comes quietly, on a night when there's nothing to distract from it, when you sit with the years and count up what you built and what you walked away from. That's not a curse. That's just life. I just kept showing up. That's the whole story. I kept showing up, and they grew, and we made something out of the years we were given. And no one, not a lawyer in a rental car, not a folder full of legal arguments, not 11 years of silence, could take that from us.